in the House of Commons to begin debating the King's speech in just some minutes' time.
Yes, His Majesty read out 40 draft laws, including plans to nationalise the railways, house-building programmes and the economy.
Well, the government says its legislative agenda will take the brakes off Britain and counter the snake oil charm of populism.
Well, we're joined now by former Conservative MP Miriam Cates and former Labour advisor Matthew Larser. Miriam, how do you feel? 40 bills read out. We were expecting 35, but no, 40 were squeezed into that King's speech. This is going to be a busy new government.
It sure is, and it's certainly not a populist King's speech, looking at some of the measures being drawn out. Now, there are a few things in there that I do think are a good idea. For example, a bill to help people consolidate their pension pots. Lots of people now work for a number of companies over their working lives. I think that's very, very sensible, very practical. I think another good measure is to scrap the £200 limit for shoplifting to be investigated. Certainly there has been a rise in shoplifting. One of the problems is that police have not been investigating any thefts of under £200. So again, I think that's a very sensible measure. But there are things in this King's speech that I think are very unsensible measures. I could speak for a long time on that, but I think one thing to highlight would be this budget responsibility bill, which would essentially give the OBR power to scrap a government budget. So an elected government, elected by the people, that brings forward a budget to, let's say, cut taxes, or let's say make a huge investment in the future, or change the way our tax system works, could actually be overruled by an unelected body, the OBR. And I think that's really taking away from the sovereignty of Parliament and effectively the power of the people. I think that's very, very worrying. But I could go on. There's many, many things in there that are either meddling or actually causing serious problems.
I'm glad you touched on that, because we hadn't given it enough attention yet, because handing that power to the OBR, Matthew, that's quite a big commitment that may have, consequences for years, generations to come.
Well, it's not handing the power to veto a budget to the OBR. It's ensuring that the OBR look at every budget before it's delivered.
Run it by.
Yeah, well, I mean, and they can raise points, and it's up to the elected government or not to overrule those points. In some ways, it'll be better than what happened under Liz Truss and Kwasi Kwarteng, where the budget happened. The OBR basically briefed the briefing anyway, and it would have been better to say, we hear you, this is the reason we're doing it, we're going to go ahead anyway. So I don't think it's giving away elected power, but it's ensuring scrutiny. Remember, the OBR was a creation of the man who was Foreign Secretary till 10 days ago, David Cameron, when he was Prime Minister, and George Osborne.
Are the OBR not are they infallible?
No, they're not infallible, and that's why I think it's right that they take a look at it, but it's also right that a government can say, well, thank you for looking at it, we're going to go ahead with this anyway, because this is a political priority.
But the problem is, as we saw in the Liz Truss debacle, the OBR does have enormous power, or certainly enormous influence, and it'd be very difficult to see an elected government being able to get away with producing a budget that the OBR disapproved of, particularly by entrenching their power in this way. And actually, the OBR does not have a great record when it comes to forecasting. They're very often wrong, and so it seems to me that actually the ultimate power and authority should stand with the people, which is Parliament, and not an unelected quango. And I think actually the OBR was a bad invention.
It's an interesting point you raise, Miriam, because of course many battles were had, 2015, 2016, and then right through until the 2019 general election, when you were elected, over that fundamental issue of the sovereignty of Parliament. Where does power lie? And it's not just with the OBR, Matthew, but it's also with devolved assemblies, it's also with extra powers for trade unions. Of course, big battles in the 1970s over who...
Yeah, I don't think that the measures today amount to return to the 1970s.
But of course, there is a discussion here over where does power sit in Britain, and that could be a big theme of the next 4 or 5 years.
Yeah, absolutely. I actually think that mayors are going to be quite a big issue, because I think there's two things. One, I think that the mayors, the Labour mayors, are going to be effectively the real opposition, because they have these fiefdoms. They're also, outside of London where there is an assembly, they're also basically unscrutinised, because they just basically are scrutinised by the leaders of the local councils. Now, in Greater Manchester, Andy Burnham's the mayor. That's normally 11, occasionally 12 out of 12. Sorry, 9 out of... anyway, it's almost all of them. And the same goes in other parts of the country. So you basically get one-party states. And also, of course, what happens is the leaders of the local councils are all given jobs. They're all the deputy mayor for this or the lead on that. So it's not exactly like having a robust, even a council chamber against them. So I think, yes, we need to give the mayors certain powers. We're giving powers on buses, for example, beyond the metro mayors. It's already happening in places like Manchester.
They're always going to want more, though, aren't they, Matthew?
Yes.
We've seen that with Devolution.
We've seen that in Scotland.
We're supposed to strengthen the union, and what's happened instead?
Well, look, every time I hear the phrase Devo Max, a shiver goes down my spine. terrifying because it takes me back to the eve of the Scottish referendum, where that was the promise in return for voting no in Scotland. It was, I think, with a covenant with the Scottish people on the front of the Daily Record. And, I think there has to be a limit. I think the government needs to be careful that in the first days where it seems nice, have the jolly selfie outside Downing Street with the mayors, even being nice to the sole Tory Ben Houchen getting in the selfie. Yeah. It's just that, nice, warm words, but actually, as you say, look at the detail of how it's going to operate.
Miriam, do we want second-rate politicians in this country to have more power concentrated in their hands?
I don't think it's necessarily that they're second-rate.
I'm not talking about any
individual. I think it's that the model is completely wrong. And I support devolution in principle. I think that decisions should be taken as close as possible to people they affect. But the problem with the model that we have now is essentially the mayors are just an additional level of bureaucracy. And they don't have tax-raising powers, which most people would probably think is a good thing.
Or indeed tax-cutting powers.
But they don't have tax-cutting powers. So they can go to Westminster and say, we want more money. And if the government says, no, there is no more money, they can go back to their electorate and blame the government. Now, that's worked well for Labour mayors under a Conservative government because they have blamed Conservatives and austerity for bad buses, etc., etc. It's going to be very interesting to see what happens next because there isn't any more money.
The Labour-run
and yet suddenly the Labour mayors are not going to be able to blame it on the government, or if they do, they're very quickly going to lose support.
This could be where more powers for local mayors is actually a very good thing for growth in the country. Currently, if there's a local authority or a local mayor who says, I don't want this to be built here, I don't want that new power station or whatever it is, this new business doing economic activity, well, if they approve it, they don't get any of the benefits. They can't sort of, other than business rates, they don't collect any of the extra economic activity, any of the settling off. Yeah. That doesn't happen. If they were able to get revenue from things that they approve, that could generate more economic activity.
It could, and that's the kind of model that could work better because you have power and accountability. But the problem we have in Britain is that we're such an imbalanced economy, and we're the most imbalanced economy in Western Europe. And actually, you'd probably find that the vast majority of the metro mayors, certainly in South Yorkshire, are actually starting from such a disadvantageous point in terms of the amount of business revenue, the kind of entrepreneurial headquarters and things like that you have, but they would never, ever catch up. And, whilst as a Conservative I hesitate to say what we need is state intervention, actually, in some of these areas, what we do need is state intervention because outside of London and the South East, all of our regions are actually dependent on the wealth created in the capital. And that's a very difficult place for these mayors to start from.
Miriam, another area that we haven't spoken about, and it only got a quick mention in the King's speech, is this ban on conversion practices. And this relates more so to transgender people, children, mostly, I presume. And this is a bit of a controversial one. I'm not sure many people really understand what this is all about. The idea of conversion practices sounds awful, sounds medieval. Yeah. Almost. But this could be worrying.
Yes, and, you're right. Some of the ideas that people will have of what this means are actually, of course, appalling, but are already illegal. Anything coercive or violent is already illegal and covered by numerous other bills. But the problem with trying to stop somebody from preventing, let's say, a child from pursuing their gender identity, so let's say you've got a girl and she thinks that she's been born in the wrong body and she wants to be a boy, a bill like this could potentially make it illegal for a teacher or a counsellor to say to that girl, no, actually, you're not a boy. We're not going to let you go down the route of hormonal therapy or medical treatment. We're going to watch and wait and hope that, you grow out of it or that you realise this is not a good decision. Now, obviously, that's an extreme challenge, not only to free speech, but parental rights to prevent a parent from protecting their child from gender ideology. And what makes this position from Labour such a nonsense is that just yesterday, Wes Streeting has said that he will continue the ban that the Conservatives put in place on puberty blockers for children. So the government is preventing children from pursuing gender identity, and yet at the same time they want to bring in a bill that will criminalise people from preventing a child from pursuing their gender identity. It's a nonsense. But what's really interesting is that they've only committed to bring in a draft bill. And every draft bill we've seen so far, there have been two so far in Parliament this year, have been thrown out because it's been proven so difficult to legislate in this area. So I don't think it's necessarily guaranteed that it will happen.
That's interesting. Let's throw that dichotomy over to Matthew Larser, because there does seem to be the government talking through two sides of its mouth on this issue. On the one hand, Wes Streeting saying no more puberty blockers for children. On the other hand, this conversion ban.
Well, no, absolutely not, because the briefing of the ban is quite clear that the new draft bill will respect the legitimate psychological support and treatment on non-directive counselling and respect the important role that parents, teachers, religious leaders and carers have in supporting those exploring both their sexual orientation or their gender identity. So I think that, it is important those caveats are in there. It's important that the lessons of the Cass Review are learnt, but it's also important that we ban the horrific practice of conversion therapy, which it is appalling is still legal in our country.
I guess it's difficult to know exactly what they mean by conversion practices, because if it's something that's violent or physically abusive, then of course that is already illegal, you'd hope, under
Emily,
whereas therapy is where it gets all vague, because is therapy someone saying, not affirming their new gender identity?
It's not. I remember the vast majority of people that have been subject to conversion therapy have not been people questioning their gender. They've been people questioning their sexual orientation, and they've been, this is a bill that will mostly provide an issue as your sexual orientation and the sort of ex-gay movement, the kind of trying to exercise.
Look,
I mean, even if it's one person, it's one person too many. But yes, it's more widespread than you think. I mean, you look online at the
which is why
filming.
Two bills have already been thrown out of Parliament this year, two private members' bills, one in the Commons, one in the Lords. The problem is there is no legal definition of gender identity or transgender, and there can't be, because unlike sexuality, gender identity is an idea. You can't prove whether somebody feels male or female. It's just not something that you can define in law.
True also of sexual orientation. We haven't discovered a gay gene. We can't sort of look at anything physiological about someone.
But the thing about gender identity is that people who subscribe to this idea, they want other people to affirm them in that gender identity. So it's part of the whole ideology that other people agree that you've actually now become a woman. Whereas, of course, that's not the same with sexual orientation. You have a sexual orientation, regardless of whether anybody else knows about it, agrees with it, whatever. Gender identity is something entirely different. You can't define it in law. And what the bills that have come before Parliament have tried to do is actually create these circular definitions, and they've tried to create safeguards for parents. But the most recent one was parents are protected from this ban on conversion therapy unless they're practising conversion therapy. Now, that's, again, a circular definition. So the Government Equality Office spent 2 years trying to come up with the form of words. Two private members have tried to do it. They've all failed. I don't think it's possible.